February 2nd, 1943, Stalingrad, Russia. The wind that morning moved through the broken windows of what had once been the tractor factory district. Snow drifted over the wreckage, softening the outlines of tanks whose engines would never start again. Inside a basement command post, a single radio operator sent the final transmission from the 6th Army. It was 7:45. The message was brief, almost clinical. No further communication possible. After that, silence settled on Stalingrad. Across the ruins, frozen soldiers waited for the inevitable. Some stacked their rifles in neat pyramids. Others burned maps to keep warm. They had been told relief would come. It never did. The men who had once advanced across Europe now crouched beneath the ashes of a city they could not pronounce, surrounded by an enemy they had called inferior. In Berlin, the news arrived not as a shock, but as confirmation. The senior officers who gathered around the situation map that evening had already sensed the truth for months. The lines on the chart no longer represented movement, but confinement. The German army, stretched across 2,000 miles of front, had reached the limit of its reach. For the first time since 1939, it had nowhere left to go. They did not speak of defeat. They used other words: reorganization, stabilization, temporary reversal. Yet behind those euphemisms, the calculation was clear. The loss of Stalingrad was not an isolated failure. It was the mathematical proof of a system collapsing under its own momentum. The numbers told the story better than propaganda ever could. Supply convoys averaging 400 kilometers of exposure, replacement divisions arriving at half strength, fuel consumption exceeding production by 20%. The machine that had conquered Europe had outrun its engineers. In the field diaries of corps commanders, a new tone appeared that winter. The entries were stripped of rhetoric and filled with arithmetic. 200 liters per vehicle short, 800 casualties per kilometer. No communication with the left flank since Tuesday. The language of victory, speed, surprise, shock, had been replaced by the language of depletion. At the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler refused to alter a single plan. He insisted that willpower could substitute for steel and oil. When reports arrived of surrender in Stalingrad, he dismissed them as exaggerations, demanded new offensives, and spoke of destiny. The generals around him listened in silence. Some still believed. Others began to understand that belief itself had become a liability. Among those officers, the realization came quietly. It did not arrive with the fall of a city or the destruction of a corps. It came in patterns: convoys that never returned, telegrams that repeated the same request for fuel, the familiar names of divisions erased from weekly reports. The evidence accumulated like snow on an empty steppe. In February 1943, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched a counterstroke near Kharkov, regaining ground and headlines. Berlin celebrated it as proof that German genius still prevailed. But inside the general staff, the applause sounded hollow. They knew the victory had been purchased by cannibalizing reserves meant for the following summer. Every triumph now was a mortgage on the future. Intelligence summaries painted the same picture. Soviet tank production outpaced Germany's 4-1. The Red Army, once scattered and disorganized, was reorganizing with Western machinery and American fuel. For the first time, German officers began to study enemy doctrine seriously, not to exploit weakness, but to estimate how long until superiority became irreversible. Most concluded, less than a year. In private correspondence, language shifted. The word Sieg, victory, disappeared from letters home, replaced by Hoffnung, hope, or by nothing at all. Commanders censored their own optimism, recognizing it as dangerous nostalgia. The front no longer expanded, it merely endured. Within the ruins of Stalingrad, Soviet loudspeakers played marches to mark their triumph. The sound carried over the river and into the ears of the last isolated German groups still refusing to surrender. Those who did survive captivity would later recall a sense not of shock but of release, as if a prolonged suspense had finally ended. The officers who remained at liberty understood the same thing. The battle for Stalingrad had not only destroyed an army, it had punctured the illusion that Germany controlled the rhythm of the war. After the surrender, Hitler summoned his field marshals to the Reich Chancellery. He spoke for hours about betrayal, cowardice, and divine testing. None interrupted. When he finished, he demanded renewed loyalty. They raised their hands mechanically. In that moment, obedience replaced conviction as the final discipline of the German army. Behind the salute, however, the quiet calculations continued. If the Eastern Front required 3 million men to hold, and the Western garrisons absorbed another million, and if the available pool of manpower declined by 200,000 each month, the equation ended in one outcome. The generals did not say it aloud, but every officer capable of multiplication knew it. Throughout the spring of 1943, the reports from occupied Europe grew darker. Resistance movements multiplied. Supply trains vanished into forests. U-boat losses reached unsustainable levels. For a military culture trained to measure success in territory gained, the absence of motion was itself a verdict. The empire built on movement had become immobile. In May, an officer attached to Army Group Center wrote in his logbook, "We now occupy more ground than we can supply, defend, or govern. Territory has become a burden." It was a quiet confession, but within it lay the entire fate of the Reich. Conquest had inverted into confinement. By mid-year, even Hitler's briefings began with phrases like "if resources permit" or "pending availability." The vocabulary of limitation had infiltrated the language of command. Yet the facade persisted. Orders were still issued for new offensives, even as railways crumbled under bombardment. The General Staff produced meticulous plans for divisions that existed only on paper. Stalingrad had marked the moment of revelation, but the realization spread slowly, like frost through stone. In every headquarters from Smolensk to Naples, officers felt it but refused to name it. They continued to issue directives, file reports, and salute the map pins that represented formations already destroyed. What held them together was not faith in victory, but fear of admitting the alternative. The narrator's voice tightens. The army that once prided itself on clarity now lived on euphemism. Words replaced truth. Withdrawal meant retreat. Flexible defense meant collapse. Redeployment meant surrender. Each phrase bought a few more weeks of illusion. As the summer approached, new plans took shape, plans that promised reversal through one decisive stroke. They called it Operation Citadel. It would strike a bulge in the Soviet lines near a small city named Kursk. Hitler described it as the battle that would restore balance. His generals knew better, but they obeyed. What followed would determine not whether Germany could win the war, but how it would lose it. July 5, 1943, Kursk, Russia. At dawn, a pale mist hung over the rolling fields near the small Russian town of Kursk. The ground trembled beneath the weight of 6,000 German tanks and assault guns, aligned in mathematical precision for what was intended to be the greatest armored offensive in history. Engines growled, exhausts smoked, and radios crackled with clipped voices. To the generals, it was meant to be a rebirth, a calculated stroke that would erase Stalingrad's humiliation. But even before the first gun fired, the officers in the forward command posts could sense something unnatural in the air. The enemy was waiting. Hours later, the battlefield erupted. German armor advanced into a storm of artillery and mines. Soviet positions, far from crumbling, seemed endless. Trenches behind trenches, defenses built in depth that stretched farther than reconnaissance had ever mapped. Tanks vanished into fields seeded with explosives. Columns stalled, repair units were overrun, and air cover faltered. Within days, the initiative that had once defined the Wehrmacht was gone. Kursk did not unfold as a battle of movement. It was an industrial collision, fought not by strategy, but by sheer production. Inside the Führer headquarters, the atmosphere turned brittle. Reports filtered in, divisions mauled, momentum lost, weather worsening. Hitler listened in silence, then abruptly ordered the offensive halted. He cited the Allied invasion of Sicily as the reason, but those who read the operational summaries understood the truth. The Wehrmacht had spent its last offensive energy. Kursk was the final experiment to prove that willpower could still defeat arithmetic. It failed. After Kursk, the language of victory vanished from military communiques. The German army no longer attacked. It straightened fronts. It no longer conquered. It secured lines. The staff officers who compiled the reports avoided adjectives altogether. Objectivity had become the last refuge of disbelief. In private, they spoke of conserving ammunition, rotating divisions, and shortening supply chains. These were the words of an army learning to survive, not to triumph. In Berlin, factories burned under daylight raids. The ministries that once boasted of production miracles now hid statistics behind coded language. Coal shipments dropped by a third, steel output by half. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German modernity, lost planes faster than it could replace them. Officers reading those figures knew they were staring at a death curve. Yet the official narrative continued. The war was entering a phase of strategic defense. By late 1943, the meaning of that phrase became evident. The Red Army advanced westward with industrial relentlessness. Each kilometer gained exposed another weakness. The Wehrmacht, which had once prided itself on operational flexibility, was now trapped by geography. Too much ground, too few men, too little fuel. A machine built for movement had turned into a static monument to its own excess. Within the general staff, discussions grew tense. Field reports contradicted Hitler's optimism. Officers began referring to him in code, the artist, the architect, an irony born of fear. Meetings dragged into silence. Maps no longer inspired imagination, they recorded erosion. What had begun as a war of conquest had become a war of maintenance, a daily struggle to preserve what could no longer be justified. Letters from the front became darker. Commanders described the eastern landscape as an open graveyard of steel. Prisoners, once rare, now came in thousands. Logistics officers wrote bluntly, "We are feeding the front faster than we can replace it." Every calculation led to the same conclusion. If the war continued another year, the Reich would exhaust not just its resources, but its generation. And yet, no one dared say it aloud in Hitler's presence. His conferences were theatrical displays of conviction. He pounded tables, recited imagined troop strengths, and invoked destiny as though it were a supply line. The generals listened, nodded, and left the room to draft plans that contradicted every word. They were soldiers in a state where truth had become mutiny. Among themselves, the quiet rebellion began as arithmetic and turned into morality. Some officers argued that prolonging the war was not strategy but suicide. Others spoke of responsibility, not to Hitler but to Germany itself. Their reasoning was cold, detached, professional. If the Führer was destroying the army faster than the enemy, removing him was not betrayal, it was self-preservation. Thus began the slow gestation of the resistance within the officer corps. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, scarred from North Africa, emerged as one of its symbols. He was pragmatic, not romantic. In his notes he wrote, "If he remains, Germany dies." Around him gathered men of similar calculation, General Beck, Henning von Treschow, and others who spoke the language of logistics more than ideology. They did not imagine a restored democracy. They imagined an armistice before annihilation. But even among them, hesitation persisted. The code of obedience was older than the Reich. To defy a superior, even one leading them to ruin, was to unlearn an entire lifetime of command. Some delayed, hoping for a miracle weapon, jet aircraft, rockets, submarines that would change the balance. Others hoped the Allies would fracture, that Western democracies would turn against the Soviets. Hope became a strategy, and therefore a trap. As 1944 approached, the contradiction became unsustainable. The war Hitler promised would make Germany eternal was now consuming it faster than any foreign power could. Factories were rubble, cities ash. The generals, once architects of triumph, had become custodians of collapse. In every occupied capital, garrisons withdrew under air attack. France prepared for invasion. The Red Army approached Poland. And through it all, Hitler demanded counterattacks from divisions that existed only on paper. By May 1944, a new kind of silence spread through the German command. Not the silence of secrecy, but of resignation. Officers stopped arguing with directives. They executed them literally, knowing they would fail. Disobedience became indistinguishable from obedience. The Wehrmacht was now fighting not for victory, but for the postponement of defeat. On June 6, 1944, that postponement ended. Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. The Western Front, which many officers had hoped would remain dormant, ignited in full fury. German defenses, weakened by years of resource starvation, collapsed faster than anyone predicted. Rommel, one of the few remaining field commanders with strategic clarity, toured the front and saw the end written in sand. His words to his staff were recorded by witnesses. "The war is lost. Every day we prolong it is a crime." Those sentences circulated through the officer corps like contraband. They were repeated in whispers, carried by couriers, written in diaries that no one intended to publish. For many officers, Rommel's words crystallized the thought they had suppressed since Stalingrad. The outcome was certain. The only question was how much of Germany would be left to inherit it. The resistance moved from talk to action. Plans were drawn to kill Hitler during a staff meeting at the Wolf's Lair. The logic was mathematical: remove one man, save millions. Yet even that calculation underestimated the structure of fear surrounding him. When the July 20th plot failed, the consequences confirmed what many already knew. The war could no longer be ended from within. Hitler's retribution was methodical. Thousands arrested, hundreds executed. Generals who had once commanded armies were hanged with piano wire in basements, their names erased from records. In their place, loyalists without initiative filled the ranks. The Wehrmacht's last reservoir of intellect and pragmatism was extinguished. What remained was obedience without direction. After the failed assassination, any lingering pretense of rational command dissolved. Orders became delusional. Entire cities were declared fortresses to be defended to the last civilian. Units were commanded to hold positions long after they had ceased to exist. Hitler issued decrees as if geography itself could obey. The generals signed them knowing they were absurd, then quietly falsified reports to mask the reality. The war had entered its final phase, sustained not by logic, but by denial. The narrator's voice turns colder still. Stalingrad had been the moment of revelation, Kursk the moment of proof, and the July plot the moment of surrender in spirit. After that, everything else was execution, of soldiers, of civilians, of the idea that Germany could control its destiny. By autumn 1944, entire armies were in retreat. The Eastern Front collapsed into chaos. The Western Front crumbled under Allied pressure. Each report that reached Berlin read like a death certificate disguised as a briefing. Fuel reserves gone. Aircraft production crippled. Morale beyond repair. Yet Hitler still spoke of final victory. His generals no longer believed, but belief was no longer required. Only signatures. Only silence. When winter came again, the landscape of 1941 returned. Snow, hunger, exhaustion. The circle had closed. Those who had whispered doubt 2 years earlier now lived it openly, though still in private. They wrote nothing that might survive them. They gave no speeches. They merely endured the arithmetic of collapse. The city was already a ruin when dawn arrived. The streets that once carried parades now led only to rubble. Columns of smoke rose in the distance, merging with the low clouds that hung over the capital. Inside the Führer bunker, beneath the shattered garden of the Chancellery, the last conference of the Third Reich began. Around the table stood the remnants of Germany's high command, men who had once commanded millions, now reduced to messengers of collapse. The atmosphere was not military, it was medical. Reports were delivered like diagnoses. The Red Army less than 30 kilometers away, the Western Allies crossing the Elbe, no reserves left. When General Weidling attempted to explain that Berlin's defense was untenable, Hitler interrupted him with a trembling voice. He spoke of betrayal, of cowardice, of destiny betrayed by weakness. The tirade lasted hours. Then, suddenly, he fell silent. Witnesses later described the moment as a breakdown. A man who had built an empire on will finally overwhelmed by reality. "The war is lost," he murmured. No one replied. For the generals in that room, it was not a revelation. They had known for years. But hearing the words from the mouth of the man who had demanded blind faith was something else. It was the final confirmation that belief had devoured reason. They left the room without orders, only instructions to continue fighting for a city already dead. Above ground, Berlin disintegrated hour by hour. The front lines were no longer lines but islands, scattered platoons fighting for buildings whose addresses no longer existed. Tanks fired point-blank down boulevards lined with corpses. Civilians huddled in basements, listening to artillery like the ticking of an inevitable clock. Soldiers moved among them without direction. The uniforms were still immaculate, but the purpose had vanished. In the last operational maps drawn that week, Germany's frontiers looked like shattered glass. The Red Army pressed in from the east, the Americans from the west, the British from the north, and the French from the south. There were no reserves, no plans, only empty symbols where divisions once stood. The generals who reviewed these maps knew what it meant. The Reich was now geography without governance. Field commanders began surrendering autonomously. Some, like General Heinrichsey on the Oder, withdrew their troops without permission to spare them pointless death. Others, bound by oath, fought to the end, commanding shadows of units until silence overtook their radios. Each decision was made in isolation. The chain of command had dissolved. What remained was habit, the final stage of obedience when meaning has been lost. In late April, as Soviet artillery began striking the center of Berlin, Hitler retreated permanently to the bunker. His world shrank to a few rooms of concrete and fear. He issued orders to phantom armies, promoted officers who no longer commanded troops, and drafted proclamations no one would read. The generals who visited him did so out of ritual, not necessity. They stood at attention while he ranted about treason, nodded when he demanded counterattacks that could never happen, and left with the knowledge that the war had already moved beyond human control. Outside, the civilians understood what the generals would not say. Mothers led children through the ruins toward the western lines, hoping to find the Americans before the Soviets. Hospitals overflowed. The railway system collapsed under bombardment. Every institution that had once defined Germany's power now existed only in name. The Reich, once declared eternal, measured its life in days. On April 30, 1945, Hitler killed himself in the bunker he had built to outlast defeat. The generals who remained in Berlin were informed hours later. Some expressed disbelief, others relief. None expressed surprise. The war he had begun for immortality ended in a locked room with a pistol. The empire that had once stretched from the Pyrenees to the Caucasus now fit into a paragraph in a surrender document. In the days that followed, what remained of the German command tried to negotiate localized capitulations. Admiral Dönitz, designated successor, spoke of continuing the fight in the north to save refugees from Bolshevism. It was rhetoric, not strategy. The army no longer existed as a coherent force. Units surrendered in clusters, wandering through fields of destruction toward Allied lines. The war had ceased to be a contest and had become a migration. By May 7, 1945, in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces. The signature was small, neat, and final. In that single motion, 12 years of domination collapsed into legal closure. The generals who had survived Stalingrad, Kursk, and the bunker returned to captivity. Their uniforms pressed, but their ideology fractured. In Allied interrogation centers that summer, their tone was detached. They described operations, logistics, and leadership failures as though discussing another species. They spoke of Hitler's insanity, of the party's interference, of the inevitable material superiority of the Allies. Many insisted they had known the war was lost long before it ended. Some even claimed they had tried to stop it. Few admitted that knowledge without action was itself complicity. The transcripts from those sessions read like autopsies. Each general sought to isolate the cause of death, overextension, miscalculation, fanaticism, as if identifying the symptom could absolve the patient. But beneath the technical language lay a common truth. The defeat had not come from outside. It had been engineered from within, built into the very structure of ambition and obedience that defined the Wehrmacht. The enemy had not only destroyed them, it had exposed them. In the years that followed, memoirs multiplied. Titles spoke of betrayal, of lost honor, of tragedy misunderstood. Each author rewrote his own chronology of realization. Some claimed they saw the doom at Moscow, others at Stalingrad, others after the July plot. But every narrative shared one omission: the years in which they had still fought, still ordered men to die for an outcome they knew impossible. Their awareness, instead of ending the war, had prolonged it. The cold fact remained. By early 1943, Germany's defeat was certain. By 1944, its military position was unrecoverable. By 1945, the only variable left was the cost of denial. The generals who had once mastered war's arithmetic continued to perform its final calculation: how long a nation could survive after it had already died in spirit. In that sense, the collapse of 1945 was not an event, but an echo. It began when victory became religion, when obedience replaced reason, and when men who understood the limits of power pretended those limits did not exist. Every order after Stalingrad was a sentence in a slow confession written in blood. When the guns finally fell silent in May, Europe did not celebrate so much as exhale. The war that had consumed 6 years, 30 nations, and millions of lives ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The ruins of Berlin became the visible form of an idea carried too far. The generals who emerged from the rubble looked older than their years. They saluted no one. They wrote reports that no longer mattered. They became witnesses to the system they had sustained. The narrator's tone remained steady. Germany's defeat was not sudden. It was cumulative, the sum of thousands of private realizations ignored. Each officer who recognized the futility, yet continued to obey, contributed another fraction to the total. When history finally recorded the outcome, it found no moment of revelation, only the gradual corrosion of certainty. The war's final irony was that the men who prided themselves on foresight had seen their own ruin most clearly. They recognized the impossibility of victory, the exhaustion of resources, the madness of command. Yet they persisted, chained by the discipline they once worshipped. Their tragedy was intellectual before it was military. They understood everything except the necessity of refusal. In the post-war years, some rebuilt careers in new armies, others lived quietly in obscurity. A few faced tribunals, where they spoke of duty and circumstance. None could fully explain why the knowledge of defeat had not produced resistance sooner. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps pride, perhaps the inertia of hierarchy. Whatever the reason, the result was the same: an army that continued to fight long after its cause was mathematically extinct. When historians later traced the arc of the conflict, they found its end not in Berlin's ruins, but in earlier moments of clarity unacted upon. The defeat began when analysis surrendered to belief, when strategy yielded to myth. It began in 1941, when speed was mistaken for strength, and in 1942, when ambition outweighed capacity. Stalingrad merely revealed what had already been decided. The final images remained fixed. Generals burning documents in the bunker, surrender signatures on a schoolhouse desk, prisoners standing in silence as Allied cameras record them. Faces drained of ideology, stripped of certainty. The empire that promised 1,000 years lasted 12. Its architects spent the rest of their lives explaining how they had seen the collapse coming yet failed to stop it. That is how defeat truly unfolds, not in explosions or declarations, but in recognition denied until it becomes unbearable. The war ended in 1945, but the surrender began much earlier, in the minds of those who understood and obeyed anyway. They were men who could calculate every variable of warfare except the human cost of silence. When the last echoes of artillery faded, their legacy was not victory or even survival, but warning. For when generals see the end and still march toward it, they do not merely lose a war. They teach the world how knowledge without courage becomes destruction.